Okay, we're rolling.
Good morning. My name is Arieh Engelberg. I was born in Tarnobrzeg, near Krakow, in Poland, in 1934. And that actually shows that I was 5 years old when the war started, and Poland was invaded in 1939. This is my family. We were 3 brothers. My parents. My father was of a farming family in Poland. They had a leasehold from the Count of Tarnowski and farmed for a long period of time before the war, before even the First World War. And they had different businesses around it, including bars and hotels and stuff like that. Although the farming portion stopped after World War I because of the war and so on. My mother's family were merchants. Her father was a fabric merchant in Stary Sącz, not far actually from Tarnobrzeg. Tarnobrzeg as such at the time was a little town, most of it Jewish. And shortly after the town of Tarnobrzeg was invaded by the Germans, I wasn't too concerned about it as a child. It was only interesting, and I was infatuated with the fact of bombings that happened at the time, and we were running away to the shelter, which was not at home but somewhere else, and where exactly I can't tell. And I remember vividly the business that our parents ran, and this business was actually a restaurant and a hotel on the top floor, and they had a license to sell alcohol and all that. I remember vividly the long counter and the big stove and the kitchen, which had different interesting things that I was trying to get to know, like crawling under the counter, and there were different pipes and things and so on. I never saw the top of the counter. There was also a billiard room in this restaurant, and behind a closed door I was discouraged to go there, particularly when the adults were playing. I never saw the green, but I was infatuated with the thick legs that were carved beautifully. And that was my world. Everything was below the level of the adults. Shortly thereafter, the Poles actually organized the expulsion of Jews from Tarnobrzeg. And I vividly remember the long tables at the market where Jews were lining up. They had to bring the keys to their houses and their belongings. They could only leave with whatever they could carry. My father had a big backpack. My brothers had smaller backpacks, and my mother had me to carry or to drag. And so we were leaving town, and the Poles were around and making different comments, not particularly in favor, and my parents and all the others were very, very serious. I vividly remember when my mother, after the bombardments, the house was burned down, and I remember myself and the rest of the family. I could not tell who was there, but I remember until now my mother holding me by my hand very strongly, and we were standing and watching the house burning down. As a child, I expected flames, that there will be burning, but unfortunately, no, I was disappointed. I only saw the thick smoke coming out of the windows of the upper floor. And shortly thereafter, as I said, we were expelled and we were moving. And I do remember that there was some kind of a dispute, and my middle brother was grabbed by a pole and searched in his pockets and taken out something that was there. Apparently, I asked my brother later what was it. So he said that he had some money in his pocket, and they paid attention to it, grabbed him, and that there were no Germans around. And at one point, the Poles, the officials there, called in an officer, and I, as a child, I was impressed with him. He was good looking, had all this gear with the leather belts across his chest, and this thing. He was impressive. And apparently there also was something that actually this German officer was more favorable than the Poles that were actually co-inhabitants of the parents, and the parents called them by name. And thereafter we were told to go. Whether they were directed where to go, I don't know, but I know that we were going towards the Russian or the Soviet Union border at the time. And we were going on foot, every so often by horse and buggy, and crossing a river. I remember crossing a river. Apparently, I was told later that was the River Sun. And I remember some boats being turned over, and some Jews in the water scrambling and swimming and so on. I remember vividly a bearded Jew keeping his head up, you know, with his long beard and so on. There were no crying, no sobbing. Everyone was very, very serious, and that touched me a lot because I was not used to it. I was used to parents that were smiling and carrying me, and suddenly everyone was serious, and in many cases I was ignored. And that by itself stayed with me for a long time, and still does when I recall the situation, that the parents were there, but they were very, very serious, if not distraught. We passed villages, and in every village when we stopped by, we were hosted by Jewish families that had larger places and could accommodate. People were sleeping on the floor just to sleep over, and the next morning the same thing, going or by horse and buggy and so on. And in one place, I do remember we were staying in one house, and there was another Jewish house. There are only two households of this kind. And people were talking about it, that in the other house, a hand grenade was hurled in, and 2 Jews got killed and some others injured. And again, the same thing. I was shushed away when the parents and all the rest of the Jews were trying to talk serious talks, where to go and how to go and so on. I remember vividly one event where, and obviously the German army that was invading still Poland, wherever we came, they were there or following with us. And or we have to move away, out of the way, because the army was progressing. And at one point we were stopped and searched. My brothers and my father had to take off their backpacks, and there was a German officer telling a soldier, and both of them not as impressive as the first German soldier that I met. They were more like the soldier was in a helmet, had a gun, and had a long overcoat, and the officer was a little nicer uniform, and the uniform was gray with a green flap. I remember that, and the officer gave the instructions to the soldier, and he was looking through my father's backpack. And then I saw what the content was. There were some food items, there were little bags of sugar or other stuff and so on. And at one point, my father kind of slapped the soldier on his wrist, saying him, "Don't touch this, is whatever." And my mother got distraught. How come, he starts a fight with a Nazi soldier? That was, she was very taken by it and so on. And my father responded in German, ist doch ein Österreicher. He is an Austrian. He got to talk to him, and apparently he developed some kind of camaraderie, because my father served in the Austrian army during World War I. And this soldier was a little older. He was not a youngster like many others. And years later, my father told me that he developed this conversation with this soldier, and the soldier advised him where not to go, so that he doesn't come across vicious German units. And this kind of saying stayed with us in the family. When my mother was suspecting my father being too trusting, she would say, "No, ja, ist doch ein Österreicher," he is an Austrian. And this event stayed with the family for a long time. But apparently it was one great luck that we didn't come across this vicious unit, apparently referring to the SS units. And so we came this way close to the Soviet Union border. And there was a problem too, because the border was very porous. And later on I learned that was the area where, according to the agreement between Germans and Soviet Union, the area where we came through was part of Poland that was taken over by Russians. So whether we crossed the border or the border came across us, but it's a fact that we wound up in Soviet Union. I remember crossing this area, this border area. I was in my father's arms. It was at night. And the only thing I remember from it that there was loud speaking and some shoving and pushing. And then we wound up in a little town called Mościcko. The name suggests that it's a Polish name, but probably renamed later on as part of Russia. There were Jewish families in this place, and there was a cheder. My brothers went to school because this was my parents' approach. When you are of age, you have to go to school. And I was too young, so I went to the cheder. There was a rabbi that was teaching. I don't remember what I learned there. I actually remembered more what I learned years ago in Tarnobrzeg, the big Aleph Bet, when a rabbi was coming to the house, and I was running away and hiding, and he was smiling and laughing at it that I was running away from him. But this rabbi was very serious, and all the children were kind of ignoring me. So did the rabbi, and I don't know whether he was a rabbi or a melamed, a teacher. So I don't remember much of that. And soon after, the winter was coming, and it was cold. The room that we were in, we had a landlord. I don't particularly remember him, but I knew he was there. And as we had no wood to heat the place, it was cold, and I was taken to a baker's house. It was always warm there, and they welcomed me. There was a boy my age I played with. But later in the afternoon, when the baker and his family of adults were coming, I had to behave. That meant sitting quietly on a bench, doing nothing. I hated it. I hated it with passion, that I had to sit there and behave. Behaving meant sitting quietly and doing nothing, and waiting for my parents to come to take me back to the room where we lived, which was cold. But we managed, and although a short period of time, it looked to me like very long. I did not like it. After a while, a word came that the Russians or the Soviets are going to take all those who did not belong to this place, who were not local, and they were in their eyes an unreliable element because they didn't belong there, so that they will take them all and deport to Siberia. So obviously my parents didn't want that, and many Jews didn't want to be deported. They wanted to be close to home. The war will be over soon and they will go back home. But obviously it didn't happen. And we hid in a farmer's house. I, with my mother, were in the farmer's house itself. my father with my two brothers were hidden in the barn of the same farm. And as it happened in the morning, and it was already spring, it wasn't that cold, and I saw vividly through the window of the place where we slept a Russian soldier led by our landlord, our previous landlord, and he led them to the farmer's house. And the Russian soldier, he was not vicious, and he was completely calm. He didn't smile or anything like it, but he was not vicious. And we were led out of the house. My father, seeing that from the barn, he came out. He came out and joined us. And I remember the short conversation that the parents had in Yiddish. Why did you come out? So he kind of responded, what do you mean? You are led out. And so we all were taken on a truck, and with this truck taken to the railway station and loaded onto cattle cars. The cars had 2 layers of bunks, one on the bottom and one on the top. The Jews arranged themselves, some on the bottom layer, some on the top, one family beside the other, or divided so that the upper bunk was considered slightly better because there were 2 windows on the 2 sides of the cattle truck, and on the bottom there was nothing. The arrangement was such that there was like a wooden chute for toiletry needs, and the door was, once everybody was on board, the door was locked. It had kind of a latch where once the door was closed, the latch would close and lock the doors. There was one similar car where the Russian soldiers were. And the Russian soldiers were making sure that all the doors of the cars are closed. And the long journey started, the journey to Siberia. The train every so often would stop, and people were given a chance to go to bathrooms. We were fed, and people were arranging themselves, putting up small fires, like finding somewhere 2 bricks, making a fire between the bricks, and with a pot cooking something, and so on. And this was the arrangement. For me, it was a period of time like part of my life. That was the train, going down and going up. I had a problem going up to the train. To go down, it was easier. I would lean down on my tummy, sliding down, hanging on my head on the doors rail. The doors went, or rails shutting down and closing and so on. But coming back up, it was much harder. To begin with, at the beginning of the journey, the Jews were always very, very inventive. They invented kind of a step. I pictured it here. It was kind of a U hanging from the door rail, kind of a U hanging off the rail. And my size was such that when I stretched out my hands, I could reach this level. And with time, I kind of trained myself to pull myself up, swing up one leg, and then the other one, and trying to get up, hang myself up on the rail, pulling up onto my tummy, and then trying to get up into the car. But this activity of mine very often, not every time, was interrupted by my parents or the do-gooders. Somebody will catch me and lift me up and load into the car. I didn't like it particularly when I thought I'm already halfway there. Why did you disturb me now? And that was the life. And to begin with, I had these hardships to climb myself up. Towards the end of the journey, I already was expert in it, and I found ways to get up there. Every so often, the train would stop. Everybody was invited or led to a shower. Everybody had to shower, and once we were showering, the clothes were taken for disinfection. And we were hygienically taken care of, and we were fed sometimes just bread, sometimes a hot meal, but the parents were supplementing it, and I was not hungry. It was okay. It was okay for me because I didn't know any better. That was the life. People around me were always very, very serious, and but there was no crying, and there was no bickering. And when the train was moving, it was kind of a lullaby for me. I was falling asleep, and every so often when I would wake up, I heard sobbing. I heard people kind of heavy breathing and sobbing that they were trying to keep quiet and so on. But I vividly remember the sobs at night in the cattle carts. And during the day, nobody cried. There was no such thing, but everybody was very serious. And again, the same thing. I was ignored, and I didn't like it. But otherwise, I was fine until we reached a point where we were ordered out of the railway tracks and taken on trucks to other destination. And I remember the name of Irkutsk, a larger city. We were placed on a lake shore, an open area. People were sitting on the ground with their belongings around them, waiting for whatever comes. And we were taken by trucks, one after the other, one truck after the other. The whole content of the train was taken to different destinations, different places. Some people I never met before, some people I never saw, some new people showed up, and there were some not many Jewish people, locals, that were there since who knows how long. And we were taken to one small place called Nienasny, which was a very little place. There was a gold mine there, and there was logging. My father worked in both as a logger for our needs, because you were allowed to cut down trees not immediately close to the log houses were around. Everybody was accommodated in a log house, and in this little house that we were, it was one room log house with a wood burning stove and for heating, and my father would log some wood elsewhere, not very close to the log houses. We were not allowed to log the new growth, only the older ones. And this is what my father did to accommodate our heating needs. And as a logger, he was given a fir that was a short type of fir, not a long one, made of a bear skin. It was sewn so that the hair was inside, not outside. I, as a little boy, was dressed in a little fur that my parents brought with them for me, which I outgrew very, very quickly, but it had the hair on the outside. But this one was with the hair inside, looked very warm, and he had an axe. He was given an axe. I was very proud of it. It was a nice type of thing with a carved handle in a situation. It was not a cleaver, and it was not it was a chopper axe, not the one that splits the wood. And that was going on for quite a while. I remember the capable men were taken to dig a big trench. I didn't know what it was for, but they were digging and shoveling and so on. And it was a very interesting activity. And then winter came again. And once the winter started, I remember the provisions being brought by horse and sleigh. All the locals, there were the indigenous people there. They used caribou for hauling, and that was very interesting. I was very impressed with it. The horses were slow, but they could carry a big sleigh loaded with lots of load. But the caribou, the advantage they had, they were very swift and very fast. And the sleighs were also built that way. And the indigenous people, there were two bands, Yakuts and Buryats. I couldn't see the difference between them, but they knew. And they were leading this caribou, and they were very fast. They were taking over the horses by far. The horses were going in a track that was created by the sleigh, but the caribou was going around them, and I was really impressed how the locals did it. They would, because when the light sleighs were taking over the horses, they were going off track into the soft snow, and they would tend to tip over. So one of them would jump off the sleigh, and each time with his shoulders supporting the sleigh to get back onto track, and he would catch the last sleigh and jump onto it. Really like a sportsman now do it in the Olympics, but it was really impressive. I was impressed and watching it thoroughly. Then we were taken to another place. Moving around people was not unusual there. They would take people wherever they needed them, laborers or whatever. We were moved to another settlement which was much larger, named Svetli. And this place had a river running through it. And the river separated a settlement of locals, not indigenous, but locals that were there for years, that came at the time for gold digging or whatever, but they were there. And the other side, the left side of the river, were all the undesirables or the unreliable element of Russians or Ukrainians, whoever they were, that were deported there by the Soviet regime. Many of them, as far as I understand, they were landowners in other regions of Russia that objected the creation of different farming system and so on. So they were deported there and settled there. When we were coming and people were saying that we are here only temporarily until after the war, and after the war we are going back to our to wherever we belonged. The Russians were kind of giggling, yeah, we thought so too 20 years ago. So they were there, and many youngsters were already born there, the Russians. So I was different again. I was different. I wasn't born there. I was new. I was dressed differently. But and there was a school. A school was obviously on the right side of the river, where everything was on the right side of the river. On the left side of the river was some kind of a beginning of a development. They had a large log house, which they probably wanted to have a activity hall or a whatever. It was a one big room, and we were accommodated to begin with in this one big room with bunks on it, and one family beside the other. In this big room, we were maybe 5, 6 families sleeping one beside the other. But there was electricity already. In Nenasny, there was no electricity. Here they had it. There was a powerhouse. There was a powerhouse which was run by the locals on burning wood. And that was a short while, and people were dispersed to different dwellings of similar kind. We had an accommodation, actually in a very similar fashion, but with the locals that were there. And we were, 6 families there. And there was us. Once you enter through the main entrance, the first one on the right-hand side were us. The location close to the door was a big disadvantage in the winter because it was close to the door. Once you opened the door, there was a tremendous draft of cold air. And on the left side was another family, and they were all loggers. Usually the members of the family weren't there, except of a young girl named Natasha, and she was cuddling with her grandmother, and I was teasing her and so on, mostly because of jealousy. She had a grandmother that was always there. I did not. And after us, like on the right side was us, then was another family that there were 2 younger women with another woman which was older, and a teenage boy, and a youngster younger than I. And they were the rich family among us. They had a clock. And every so often the parents wanted to know what time is it. So I was sent to look through their opening in there. And they were rich because they had a wooden boarded kind of room. They had a wooden thing, because all the rest had like screens or something from fabric, crudely made separation. They had this wooden separation. So I was going there to have a look through the door, and I did not know how to read the time, but I knew to say where the hands were, whether the hand was on 9 or up there and so on. And the parents knew to interpret what time it was. And it took a while and that I learned to read the clock, and I could tell the time. And later on in the middle was another family, and the father was a logger, rarely there, and the mother was kind of bickering all the time, and there were 2 boys, one older than I, and the other one younger than I. And beside them, again another family where the father was again a logger and rarely there, and there was a boy my age. And the mother, every so often, if he misbehaved, she was threatening him that she will tell the father. And that was a big threat. One day I went to visit this boy in this little cubicle there, and the father was there. And I saw him kneeling in front of the stamp and pleading for his life, because the father was holding an axe in his hand and he was threatening him to chop off his head, and responding to the threats of his mother that he was kind of disciplining him that way. And he was crying and pleading for his life. I ran away and never approached this cubicle again. And actually, I don't know what happened. People were moving around, or they were moved around, and I didn't see them again. Close to the door across from us was the family of this girl, Natasha, and her parents were loggers, and there was her mother. She was obviously married, and her husband, and there was another son, a youngster, very impressive, broad-shouldered, big guy, and very pleasant, and so on. When this family were coming to visit Natasha and the grandmother, they were behind the curtain. They had a curtain. They didn't have this one thing. They were quietly talking there, and that was our life. In the middle, close to the stove, and the stove was serviced every day. Another family had to bring the wood and burn the wood to prepare for meals that people could cook on it and provide heat for the rest of the night. And obviously my parents did the same. There was a big iron plate with holes in it with rings that would cover it to cook. They would cook in cast iron pots that looked like an onion with chopped off end, and this onion would fit into the holes in the plate. They would pull out the rings according to the size of the pot and place the pot in it. That was in direct contact with the flame, and cooking was going on. Everyone was around this plate doing his things. And we, the children, that was our life, our cultural life. Some were bringing books, textbooks usually, reading, showing pictures, and so on, and giggling and playing different games, usually with the books, turning over pages, showing pictures. And war was in the air. And this cultural life around the stove kind of dwindled away, and it was quiet. Shortages started. There was on our side of the river, there was a store or a trade post, you might say. There was a trade post too. If you managed to pan some gold, you could go there and exchange this gold for gold rubles, they call it. Gold rubles were much more valuable than the regular rubles, because for gold rubles there were provisions you can buy. And with the regular rubles you could buy whatever was in the store or the trade post. But when the shortages started, there was little there. And when the war was starting, they started to draft people. This family of Natasha were all drafted. Whether all of them, I don't know, but I am sure that Alyosha, which was the younger brother, Natasha's uncle, was for sure drafted. As later I'll tell you about injured soldiers coming back. And tremendous shortages started, to an extent that there was rations of bread. Many young Russians did not relate to it very seriously, that the Russian cards were distributed, where there were coupons that they were cutting out every morning where people were going for bread. They were not taking it seriously, and they were trading it for vodka or tobacco, not keeping in mind that that could be a death sentence for them, because without a coupon like that, they had no bread and there was no food. And many suffered because of that later on, that there was no provisions available except in exchange for this rations. And at school, I started already a kindergarten. The kindergarten was a very pleasant place. It was one big room with a big round stove in the middle, or I would say a furnace for heating, because the cooking was done elsewhere. There was another room where there was cooking going on, because my mother started to work. Also, I'll tell you later what she did. And all the children that both parents worked were entitled to go to this kindergarten. And the kindergarten was from very morning to the very evening until after work, where parents were coming to collect the children. The place was clean. There were lots of games that until now I did not have an opportunity to play with any type of toy. I did not have. Everything was left behind, whatever we had. And I loved the place. It was particularly the toys where you could put together things and so on. And then we were fed, and in the middle of the day there was an hour that we had to go to sleep. To begin with, I did not like it. I wasn't used to it, but sure enough, I fell asleep every time. And I slept, and then obviously I didn't like to get up. But that was life, and it was good. I liked it. I liked the teachers that taught us songs. The locals knew already songs and recited poems. I did not, so I was different again. I was the only child, and the only child from the other side of the river. And crossing the river in the winter was no problem. It was all ice and snow, and it was fine. Every so often I would see there a person standing and digging a hole in the ice for water. It was like a well. I never saw him reaching the water, what would happen, because I couldn't stay long enough to see when he reaches the bottom. So I had to continue to go to this kindergarten and later to school. The transfer to school was kind of interesting. The graduates of the kindergarten were taken all together and led to school. The school was the biggest building in this settlement, and it had 2 stories. That was an exception. All the other buildings were only log houses, obviously, of 1 level. And again, the school was really nice. And I liked it because it was a big difference from our living quarters, where we were kind of limited in space. So I was a proud grade 1 student. And again, the same kind of procedure. At the beginning, or during the summer, there was a barge to cross the river, a very interesting technical approach, quite ingenious. I liked seeing it, and sometimes I would go and try to operate the rudder, and I was shushed away that if the rudder falls into the water and backlashes, I could be thrown out of the barge into the water. So the adults would take me away, but I was interested to see how it works and so on. So I was there, but it didn't take long until the river froze over. In September we started school. Towards the end of September, that was it. The river was frozen, so there was no problem to walk again along the water, along the river. And the river was used also to provide wood for the logs were kind of coming down the river and stopped along the place where the powerhouse was. And the powerhouse had also a sawmill where they were cutting the wood for proper size to be burnt in the powerhouse, or make wooden boards for constructions, whatever there was. And they had also a facility there that was cutting the wood, and people were chopping it. That was my mother's duty, to sit with an axe and chop the slices of wood into smaller pieces, which was then dried in a kiln. And a kiln was actually a stone kind of furnace that wood was burnt underneath, and the stones were glowing and providing the heat to dry these pieces of wood, these cubes alike of wood, which were used to run trucks. Trucks were running on these wood cubes. And my father was the one who was carrying the wood into this kiln, and my mother was the one that was sitting and chopping the pieces of wood. And this, the trucks running on wood, that was a very interesting kind of activity. I liked seeing it, what the drivers did when they filled the aggregate that was burning, that the kind of oxygen deficient burning that was creating the gas that was funneled into the engine, and the engine was running on this gas. It was kind of very interesting to see how they did it, and particularly the activity of my mother and father in there. And one day my father kind of jokingly told me, well, would you like to try and see how you can carry a bag like that? And obviously I couldn't. I just got dirty, to my mother's displeasure later on, that she had to change and wash the clothes.
Mr. Engelberg, I just have a quick question. Of the families that were...
Then towards the spring, there was kind of an event where the river started to go, and particularly at night, you could hear a loud noise like a gunshot, which was actually the ice of the river breaking through for the first time. And the Russians would saying, oh, the river is going. Rечка идет. The river starts going.
Do you remember your family celebrating any Jewish holidays or identifying themselves as Jewish? Did you notice the people in the village treating you differently because you were Jewish?
The people in the village were thinking of us as different, and they would call us the Poles, not as Jews. The Jews did celebrate, and there was even one family that the father, at least, was very Orthodox, and at the time not going out for work was a crime. And when the war started, it was a crime like against the state, which was very, very serious. But as he was a Jew, the Jews covered for them, doing something that he doesn't have to come out on Saturday to work. But it was very cumbersome for everyone. But they didn't celebrate like going out with it. But I knew that this Jewish family, that they prayed and so on. My family did not. They did congregate to pray in a home, but very kind of not vocal and no celebrating as such. If you would ask me to make a statement, I would say no, there was no celebration. And in this particular settlement, until later on, that I'll tell you what was happening. When the war started, as I said before, this cultural life of kids around the stove kind of stopped. Everyone was in his cubicle. Parents, and particularly this family of Natasha, they were drafted, and shortages, terrible shortages started. And at the kindergarten and later on grade 1 at school, we were taken for these lunches and provided hot meals. And at one point, a teacher called us and told us that when you come home today, there will be no bread. And today there will be no hot lunch because the provisions didn't arrive. There was no provision. And she continued to tell a patriotic tale and encouraging to be part of the tremendous effort of the Soviet Union to win the war. Sorry?
Can you address issues of language? Did your family spoke Polish? And then did they learn Russian? What did you do with language?
This is kind of an interesting question, but I, as a little boy, I don't remember having a problem. I communicated with all the kids around me, and and I had no problems. But yes, the Jews, or the Polish Jews, yes, they knew Polish. They didn't know Russian, but Polish was close enough that you could communicate, because it's a Slavic language after all. But the writing was completely different. I didn't know it because I didn't write neither, not this, not that. And when I went to school, I started learning, and I started learning Russian, nothing else. So I, as a kid, did not have any problems to communicate. But the parents had. Yes.
Do you remember your parents or people in the place where you lived talking at all about politics? Did you hear the name Hitler, Stalin? Did they get news? Do you know what information they gathered?
Yes. In the people, particularly in the presence of children, did not speak any politics and did not say a word about what they thought. They knew well that was forbidden, and we knew cases of Jews to begin with that squabbled or said something or were ratted about that they said something, and they were immediately removed either to a different settlement or went to jail, never to be seen again. So that was a total taboo. They did not speak about the government or about any local communist. On our side of the river where we lived, there was a commissar or a policeman with his family living on one end, close to the store and the trade post, and that was a one-street neighborhood, I would say. The other end of the street was a cemetery. That was it on this left side of the river. The right side of the river was the rest, as I said before, the living and all that. So this is as far as the politics go. It was not, but I could overhear squabbling that about the shortages and so on. And in many cases, particularly mothers, would come to school and stand there and wait during this lunch period, waiting to receive the portion of their kid that didn't make it to school, to get this portion, which was usually a chunk of bread, not a slice, a chunk, like a piece.
Were your brothers also in school?
Yes, they were also in school, and they were in higher grades. I was the youngest. My brother was 2 years older, so he obviously didn't go to kindergarten, but straight to school. And my older brother was 7 years older than I am, and obviously he was the big boy. And so they started the schooling much later than I, as a kindergarten student or a first grader. So they were going earlier to school, and I was the one that I was the only one in kindergarten and in grade 1. From this side of the river, I was the different one, and I was the only one crossing the river alone. And I wasn't scared about it. Everything was fine. And every so often in the winter, there was a whistle If it was one whistle, the kindergarten students were not supposed to leave home. If there was two whistles, no children from any grade were supposed to leave home and go to school. When there were three whistles, which I never witnessed, nobody was going anywhere because it was a tremendous weather problem and very low temperatures. But I don't remember this happening once.
Do you know from what period to what date your family was in Siberia?
Yes, I do remember that because to begin with, when the war started, it was September 39, and when we arrived to Mościcko and the first winter, it was probably 40. And when we were there, for me, a long period of time, but judging by seasons, it was only one winter. So the same spring of the same year, it was probably 1940 where we wound up in Siberia. When we left Siberia, but didn't leave Soviet Union yet, it was 44. That I remember well because I even had school certificates showing it. I stopped by the spring when the river started going. That was a big event because the river, when it started going, that means ice was creating boulders. The ice was breaking down, and crossing the river was problematical because you had to jump from one boulder to the other, and the boulders were floating in the water. So for me as a kid, occasionally I had to climb a boulder like that, which was not steady because it was floating in the water. And I was scared. Was I ever? And I obviously never admitted it because it was not manly to admit that you are scared. So to begin with, it was boulders, then the boulders were completely floating. So you were jumping from one to the other until you crossed the river. And each time to jump from one to the other, and they were both not steady, I was scared. And there was nobody there because I was the only one from this side of the river crossing it later than the adults that were going to the work, to work, but before the older kids that were going to school later on. And then,
can you tell us about how your parents came to leave Siberia? How did that happen?
they did not leave Siberia. They were taken by the authorities elsewhere. And what happened during the war, the Russians had a big settlement of Germans that settled there during the Tsarist times of Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and so on. And they had settlements along the Volga River, which was too close for comfort for the Soviet regime. So they actually took all the Germans when the German armies were progressing into Russia. They took all the Germans and sent them to Siberia. But the region across, along the river, Volga, was the breadbasket of all of Russia, if not half of Europe during during the Tsarist times. So they needed people to settle this place. So they took all those that were in Siberia and took them and us. And then we met many other Jews that came from other settlements on other regions from Siberia or other places, and met them and created a new community with very few or nobody of those that we left to Siberia that came back. So in 44, this is what happened. We were taken into a place called Krasnoarmeysk region, and the name of the village was Splavnucha, which was totally empty of the Germans, but there were houses there that had stoves, each one separately, and there was lots of signs of German presence, like in school. There were maps for studying geography. They were in German. And many other signs of German presence, like, for instance, there were electric wires all over, but there was no electricity, because once the Germans left, the equipment was squandered and not operational. So there was no electricity there, although in Siberia we had electricity. Not only electricity, we had a loudspeaker in our dwelling there. Not a radio, but a loudspeaker. You could turn it on and off, and you could listen to Radio Moskva. Particularly, we were interested in this news that they were transferring and so on. That was in Siberia, and it was not like that in this portion of Russia. On the Volga, just because it was squandered and so on. But there was a school, and the school was clean and heated only part of the day, because the number of students was much smaller. The school had 2 stories, but the presence was much smaller. I should mention that still in Siberia, you asked me about how we left Siberia, but before we left Siberia, still it was probably 42 or 43, when the war was going on, when Natasha's family was drafted, they started to get letters. And this I will never forget. That will stay with me for a long time. Natasha, and then I learned that Natasha was older than I, because she could read. She was reading letters to her grandmother. And this grandmother was sobbing. She was trying to control it, because people were around. There was 5 or 6 families around. And she was sobbing so bitterly that I never left our cubicle again. I was sitting there, so did the other kids. And that was terrible. And shortly thereafter, I understood what was happening, because injured soldiers were coming back. and the grade 10th students were drafted. Whether they were drafted or volunteered, I don't know. But many of them came back because when there was a breakthrough in the war, the Soviet government released them all and ordered them to go back to school. And they came back to grade 10, and they were all in uniforms because it was a neat dress code, much better than the civilian clothes that they had. And in one particular case, I remember, there were others, but this particular person came, he was injured in the war, and he came back to this left side of the river. And I remember that everybody knew that he is coming. The last portion of traveling was on foot in the summer. And he arrived. And he didn't look particularly heroic. His leather boots were kind of dirty and dusty. He had this bag on his, like a kid bag on his back. He was in summer uniform. It was summer, and I was sent to bring water from the spring because that was cool water, and I was running very quickly to bring it because everybody was taking a sip from the same kettle and so on, and this person too. And he told, and I vividly remember that they were ordered an attack around Stalingrad. And this attack is well described in English literature, actually. And they went on an attack against the Germans, and he was saying that 2-3 soldiers from here was Alyosha running with all the rest. And he remembered him falling onto the snow in a pool of blood. But they were ordered not to stop because there are ambulances following them, and they had to go forward. This soldier coming back had his right sleeve was empty and attached to this upper shoulder. He was missing an arm. And as I said, he didn't look as heroic as we were shown and sang in the songs that we were taught. We sang songs. I remember some. If you want, I can sing it to them.
Of course, of course.
There was one song telling about an old mother sitting at a window, and it stayed with me always because it reminded me of the sobbing babushka, and telling that a soldier says, I know that you are sitting at the window sobbing and looking for me to come back, and so on. Don't worry, mother, I will come back. But obviously Alyosha did not. The reality was not as the songs tell. And that was one of them. And there was another one that stayed with me because I understood very well the words, but it didn't sit with me well. There was a song, Снег лежит пеленой, словно земля. Уходил батальон в бой на врага. Помни, отчизна моя, слушай, отчизна меня, за тебя, край родной, иду на бой. What it actually says that there is a snow and a battalion is going to war, which reminded me always about this attack that Alyosha was going to. And it says actually, pomni is remember, or in Hebrew later on he learned it zachor. And slushai is shma in Hebrew, or listen to me. And it says, listen, my fatherland. Remember me, my father. It says, remember. What that meant to me, just 1 second. He is going to war and he knows that he's going to be killed because he appeals to his people to remember him. But he's not dead yet. He's going. So it didn't sit well with me. And but, well, who knows? Maybe the one who wrote this song was Jewish, because it says Shema, and it says Zachor.
I think we should take a quick break. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Maybe he'll grab some.
Hey, we're rolling again.
I'd like to ask you some questions about the time when your family fled originally from Poland. Were there groups of Jewish families that went together?
Yes, very, very much so.
Were they friends? Were they family? Were they related?
Yes, obviously it was a community that was bound together by family ties or groups and so on, and those were the makers, the doers, or whatever. And there was a religious group too. They were as any other Jewish community. Or if you are interested in the community, I have here some material I can show you. And like the town where we lived, after the war, the new generation, or but many obviously remember the Jews there. The Poles, because there is no single Jew there until now in Tarnobrzeg, the locals wrote about it, and they created this what they call historical files, and described in the first file of this periodical, they described the Jews of Tarnobrzeg, and obviously names like Engelberg are there. I don't know the family connection to it, but the family name is there.
And
so,
did you have grandparents on both sides? What happened with them?
yes. Now, my paternal grandparents, they died before the war. My mother's mother, on the mother's side, she also died before the war. And the grandfather, on the run towards the Soviet border, we came across him. And I remember him with this long beard and so on. And as a kid, I remember kind of a event that I didn't like. I was in with bad relationship with him about the toys that I was not allowed to use or whatever when I was going through their house. And my mother was telling me off that I misbehaved with my grandfather, but to tell details, I don't know. I remember the beard, and I remember his presence, but not details that I could say I had a grandfather. I did not.
When you were in hiding in the farm, there was a time when you were in hiding in a
Yes.
farm. Was the farmer Jewish or
No.
not? No.
No.
And when you were betrayed by the landlord,
Yes.
was the landlord Jewish or Polish?
Oh, Jewish.
Jewish.
Jewish, very Jewish. And apparently I heard later on that when the Soviets settled in, he was a collaborator with the communist regime.
Okay, that's all the questions I have.
But of course, that betrayal by the landlord, seen as that led to being deported to Siberia, right?
This was luck.
Was tremendous luck.
Yes, it definitely our survival is based on two major events that are actually our luck. The fact that we were expelled from Tarnobrzeg, for one, because those who stayed behind, and Poles in some of the articles that they write, they are writing about some Jews that managed to get back to Tarnobrzeg. They don't know how they managed to survive. Well, I know they did not survive, those who came back. And the same thing happened with this landlord that betrayed us. We were lucky that he did, because we were deported to Siberia, because those who were not were one way or another exterminated or did not survive it. We did, based on these two particular events that were our luck. And I want to add to your previous question about the religious way, how and whether other Jews related to it. My mother always lit Shabbat candles, always, didn't miss once. When the shortages came, obviously there was no wax, no candles, and so on. So she would lit some in making a improvised wick in a bit of oil and burn that. And at one point, well, there were shortages of everything. Oil was also in short supply. So one day she did not. And she later said that her father came to her in her sleep, and she dreamt that he is telling her and asking her, why didn't you? So since then, she didn't even miss that. She would take a potato, dig out a hole, put some oil in it in a wick, and do that. And she was saying that the Russians probably think that she's doing some kind of witchcraft or something. But this is what it was. Shabbat candles had to be there, and actually we maintain it and we passed it on to our children too.
So let's get back to Siberia.
And now we're moved to the Volga in 1944, right?
Yes, and we are already on the Volga River in the German side. One important thing about it, there was food. They were growing wheat and they were growing other things, and my parents were both working in the farming activities of the place, whatever there was. And I was a school child, and this was in the Soviet Union. That was a crime not to send children to school. You had to go to school, and my parents, as such, they encouraged us always. Wherever it was, whatever it was, the first question was, where is the school? Children have to go to school. And that was always until the very end. We were schooled. But there were shortages too, because this war was going on and the army had to be fed. Everything was going to the army. Все для фронта, все для победы. That was the main slogan. Everything for the front, everything for victory. And it was practiced. So there were shortages. And they had one system there. We were on a kolkhoz, and they came up with an idea that if you go and harvest potatoes, and you harvest 10 sacks for the kolkhoz, your payment will be 1 sack. So obviously everybody was going on their free time, because during their hours of work, everybody was working wherever ordered to go. And this was one thing. There were potatoes. And the other thing was wheat. What today we buy as cracked wheat or Bulgar wheat, we did that ourselves. Improvised tools to crack wheat or to do things and so on. But wheat had to be stolen, because you were not allowed to own wheat. You were allowed to have flour. And because flour was distributed by the government, everyone had a portion and so on. So it was a commonplace to fill up the pans. People had pans tied up on the bottom and fill up the pans with some wheat in it, bringing it home and doing whatever, so that that you had something to eat. Although, and that was a great luck, that it was available. Nature provided this part of Russia with capability to produce food.
And your family stayed there through the end of the war?
To the end of the war. That was from 44 to 46. We left there. We were sent out of there in 46. And at one point, a word came that an inspector is coming to town and they are going to search all these huts for illegal activity. So my older brother, he was the adult in the family, like the parents, and he hid away the bag of wheat we had, but he didn't hide it well enough. It was found, and my father was taken to court and sentenced for 2 years in jail. And he had an alibi, but the alibi was not enough, and he got 2 years. 2 years, the locals were giggling about it, that this is a childish sentence, because normally the sentences were much higher. And 2 more Jews that were sentenced the same way, the same date actually with my father, they got much higher sentences. So when we left there, again, we didn't leave, we were sent out. That was in 46, when there was agreements between New Poland and the Soviet Union that all the Polish citizens will be sent back to Poland. So the same procedure, we were taken in this case on sleds, because it was a spring of 46. The snow started to thaw, and again there were differences between high-level Jews, low-level Jews, they were active in there. But one thing to mention, that it was towing not only of the snow, but of religious activities and permission of doing different things. And the Jews organized themselves, and they had already Passover baking, and they had a large gathering for prayers and active singing and praying in one location with the, I wouldn't say the government approval, but the government tolerance of activity of this kind.
Was this in Volga?
This is on the Volga River. That was in the area of Saratov, the region of Krasnoarmeysk, and the name of the place was Splavnucha, was the farming community.
By the time your family was sent back to Poland in 1946, had any word of the fate of the Jews in Poland reached them?
Yes, it did. And
make a complete sentence out of that. Like my family knew.
Yes, immediately were still in Siberia. We got a letter from Palestine, and that was a great event in the village. What happened, the Polish army that was organized by the Russians, and they actually fled, the army under the General Anders, they fled to Iran from Russia, from their from the area where they were placed, and they arrived as a British army. They joined the British army and arrived to through Iran to Palestine. And in Palestine, they when the young Jews were leaving for this army, they passed on addresses, and two of my cousins were on a kibbutz in Palestine at the time, and this Jews that went in with the Anders army there passed on the thing and the address, and we received a letter from Palestine. That was a great event all over. So there was a communication, and there was already then, by word of mouth, we received the knowledge that Jews are being mistreated and killed and so on. And when we were in this Volga region, there was already exchange of letters, and there was evidence from the injured soldiers coming back, telling stories of what they heard and what they knew. And there was lots of it. We knew what is happening. And then, as I started telling with the on sleighs, the better qualified Jews and Polish citizens, they had the horses with the sleighs, and the rest had bulls that were towing the sleighs. And actually those who had the bulls were much better off, because the snow started thawing and there was mud, and the horses were not good in pulling a sleigh in mud, but the bulls did. They pulled whatever.
Can I clarify, was your father in prison from 1944 to 1946?
No, he was jailed in 45, beginning 46, and we actually left without him. but we had the address where he was, and my older brother was going once a week or so, going to jail, providing him with food, mostly potatoes, because there were shortages, obviously, in jail too. So when we left, that was one big disadvantage and one sad point, that we left without our father. And then obviously with these horses and bulls, we were taken into this cattle cars the same way, but this time I didn't have to scramble to get on top of it. I was already a youngster, which managing to get up onto and off the cart, in many cases much swifter than the adults. And there was again the same procedure like to Siberia, and going through, coming closer and closer to the border, total devastation of villages burned down to the ground, leaving chimneys only standing, and coming to across the border to Poland, even worse. And even worse for one reason, that many Jews thought or eluded themselves that maybe an acquaintance or a relative will come to the train to meet them. There was nothing there. Everything, the train was going through total devastations through all the towns and villages. It was terrible, particularly the feeling. And again, the night sobbing of some people at night. It was even worse than ever. And people were stressed and all that, with all the stories, and many knew not to expect anything, and the population was hostile to an extent that no Jew left the train. There was one Polish family that was with us throughout, and they left the train going to their village that was at a distance from the train. So they left, but no Jew left the train until we came close to the border of Poland with Czechoslovakia at the time, and the train stopped, and that's it. So there we were taken off the train, and Jews got organized like anywhere. We were placed in a building that was probably a residential building, and so few families in one room, the same type of thing, and being fed. People were going with their utensils to get their food. One thing was about it, that there was no threat of killing again, but there was total devastation. And there were many Jews that were singers and artists, or players of instruments that were trying to keep up the spirits of Jews, but it was terrible in a large extent, because what it was like forcefully tickling people to laugh, but not a natural laugh. And you could see it, that people for the moment were laughing and enjoying it. But as when the entertainment, the improvised entertainment stopped, it was off. And it was, again, the same grim faces and so on. And there were immediately organizations. The border was porous, and the Zionistic organizations, or organizing by themselves, were crossing the border and joining different groups of displaced, of DPs, displaced peoples.
What town were you in?
We were in the town named Klocko, and it was close to Wrocław. Wrocław is Breslau. That was the area that the Poles regained after the war. It was previously Germany. It was Silesia, Śląsk. And the local population was hostile again. It wasn't like in the Soviet Union. When we were youngsters, we didn't know Russian or anything. You go to school, and the teachers will deal with it. They will find a way. It was not like that in Poland, maybe elsewhere, but not in the new areas of Poland. The Jews organized themselves and created a Jewish school until it took about a year or two until people or Jews dispersed and got into the the Polish educational system. But again, it was a terrible feeling, and as a youngster, I joined with my brother a Zionistic group, Hashomer Tzair. We sang songs. Some of them we didn't understand even the content of the words, but we did sing it. And some of them I did understand, but felt disturbed by it. Like there was one song in particular. It was a nice song we sang. We sang different languages. As a group of Jewish kids, we spoke Russian, all of us. And for about 2 years thereafter, we spoke Russian more than anything else until we settled and started to speak Polish again. And the parents spoke Yiddish. And the songs that we sang in the youth groups was Russian mostly, then Polish and Yiddish. And in Yiddish there was one song that disturbed me. As I said, it was saying, Sei freilich, ist dir nicht gut, erzähl es nicht, sei freilich, nur freilich sollst du sein. It disturbed me because of, what do you mean, sei freilich, ist dir nicht gut? If you have it bad, don't tell anyone, and being happy. Be happy. No matter what, be happy. Although you are not feeling well about it, you are feeling bad. Don't tell anyone and be happy. And that disturbed me. Why don't tell anyone? Keep telling, scream, and so on. No, that disturbed me, but I sang it with all the rest. We sang different other songs and so on.
Can you talk about how the Polish people treated you when you came back? Treated Jews or you? How did you feel?
Terrible towards anyone, because the relationship with Poles was terrible from the beginning, because with my parents there was, even in the shtetl before, my mother, when she was telling a story about some times ago, every so often she would say, "Oh, that was at the time when the mob was going for the Jew." So that was the approach, that the events of mob going for the Jew, there were events that other stories were connected to. So when she was telling a story, she would every so often say that. And my father was telling stories of similar kind, like when he was a soldier and came back to, by the way, when Austria lost the war, the First World War, he was the only one from the settled Jews that came back to Poland. All the rest stayed wherever their units were dispersed. Like my father was in Italy at the time. So two of his cousins went, one of them wound up staying in Italy. The other one stayed in Italy, wandered off to Switzerland and stayed there. And therefore I had cousins in Switzerland. And I had the one in Italy in the end went to Palestine. And they were telling that they were three cousins in this family that they had. One was born in Poland, one was born in Italy, and one was born in Palestine at the time. Everyone in a different country. But they all came back to Tarnobrzeg to take brides. They took brides and went back wherever they came from. My father was the only one that stayed there because he had an inheritance. And this is obviously a big disadvantage for him. All the rest that stayed wherever did much better.
Did you or your family, anyone in your family, go back to your village after the war?
No, but my mother did. Again, we had an inheritance, so she wanted to see what she can salvage. And she was telling a story that she visited with her classmate. And the classmate said to her, do what you want. During the day you can be here, but I cannot sleep you over. Because she was afraid of retaliation of other Polish groups that were there. No Jew came back to settle in this town. So as Kraków was closed, so she went back to Kraków to sleep over and then came back to do what she could. And she told us terrible stories, like she went to a house that actually belonged to the family because they had different places there and that belonged to the family. And she said that the Polish woman, her classmate, was washing the floor, and after washing the wood boards, this was the floor, were wet. So to protect the floor, she was placing covers of my grandfather's holy books on the floor, not to step on this freshly washed floor. Or she was telling another story that she met on the street a person that was delivering mail. And the same person delivering mail before the war, delivering after the war, the same thing. And she recognized him, he recognized her, they had a chat, and she remembered him as a child. he was telling her that one day I'll bring a love letter for you from your lover. And she was saying yes, and one day he did. And another case, when she was visiting with his classmate, a woman that was washing laundry. And she was picking up the laundry and bringing it back to the family when it was washed. And before the war, she collected laundry. And when she visited after the war, this woman came with a package of laundry that she collected before the war and handed it over to her. And in the laundry were things of the children that grew out of it. And she said, keep it for your grandchildren. And that was the only bright light from town object that my mother carried out, because other stories were terrible. Like in another house that also belonged to us, a cobbler was there, and this was a cobbler that was sitting there, renting it before the war, and he was sitting there after the war. And my mother offered him to transfer the title in return for 3 pairs of shoes for the 3 of us. And he refused. He said, I was here before the war, I am here now, nobody is going to move me. So different stories of this kind, which were different. And obviously, many terrible atrocities the children were telling at school, and offbeat track and so on, how they survived and so on. And a child that was betrayed by, she was hidden by one farmer, betrayed by the other farmer, and she was hidden in a haystack when they came to look for her, and how they were looking, because he betrayed them. He said that he saw them staying here in this haystack, how they came with spades and looking for her in this haystack. Different stories of this kind, how children survive. And she herself was, when she was telling that, she was a little thing that no wonder that looking for her with the spades, they missed her because she was so tiny, even when she was telling it.
So you started to join a Zionist group of young people?
Yes. And there was also, as I said, the border was porous and people were escaping, and there were also very bad stories, like we were supposed to smuggle the border. And my mother paid a smuggler, or the one who arranged the smuggling, an installment that we were be taken over the border. And a day before the date that we were supposed to go, he disappeared with the money and everything.
This is from which border to which border?
From Poland to Czechoslovakia. And then in Czechoslovakia, one could declare himself as a DP and do all the arrangements necessary to go wherever and whatever country was ready to take them. Zionist organizations were active there, collecting all the DPs and organizing them to go to Palestine at the time, and Israel later. And as he disappeared, my older brother, acting as the man of the family, kind of spoke with my mother and said, this is a sign that we shouldn't leave without our father. Let's stay until father gets released. And he was released from jail, but getting a permit to leave the Soviet Union, it was another story. Usually paperwork and procedures. So, but we were continuously in touch with him, and we knew, and one day he showed up. He came back in 48. So that was exactly 2 years after, because 2 years in jail in the Soviet Union was 367 days times 12, times 2. There was no good behavior provision.
And so when he arrived?
When he arrived, we legally applied for papers to leave, and we had to give up our Polish citizenship, but we got all the papers, you know, stamped, many stamps and so on, and we were allowed to live like all the rest. And at the time, as it was already 48, and we applied in 48 and left in 50. 1950, we left Poland for good to Israel. And all the rest is a known history.
So you had your children, when did you meet your wife? Where?
Oh, we met in Israel. We met in 64. And I did all my schooling, because this was our parents' motto. You are of this age, you go to school, you know Hebrew or not, you go, you will learn it. And I joined a trade school in Jerusalem, and it's very interesting. They were not bothered by the fact that I didn't know Hebrew, but they were bothered very much by the fact I didn't know English. And in Poland, when I started studying there, I took French as a foreign language. So I didn't know a word of English. So the school from Reshet Amal, which was an organization that led these trade schools, and they organized a tutor for quite a few of us that came from other countries, and having the same faith and having no English. They provided a tutor in English, but not in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it was you were on your own. And I was. I managed. Within few months, I was as proficient in Hebrew as many others.
So you speak Russian, Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, English?
Yes. Yes, in our family we spoke simultaneously all these languages. Like the parents would talk between them Yiddish when they would approach us. They would speak Polish, and we between us, with my older brother, I would speak Polish because I regarded him as the older person. With my younger brother, he was not young, he was only 2 years older. I spoke with him Russian. Even after we left Russia, about 2 years, and then we started to speak Polish, and later on in Israel, obviously, Hebrew. So we spoke all these languages, kind of mishmash. Whoever approached who, you knew by the language spoken who he is approaching.
Did your parents speak? What did your parents speak together?
Yiddish. between them. Yeah. And as Krakow was Galicia, and Galicia belonged to Austria at the time, their foreign language was German. So whenever necessary, like my mother was corresponding with her brother, that was one of those Austrian soldiers that did not come back, or came back and escaped immediately. He settled in Belgium. So she corresponded with him in German, because he settled in Belgium and created a family there. So his part of the family, as a foreign language, they also spoke German. So she corresponded with him in German. So we had this mishmash of languages.
When you were in Israel, did your parents talk much about their wartime experience?
No. That was for some reason, a taboo. They were more interested to speak about pleasant things that brought a smile on our faces than to remind us of the grim and terrible areas. Although I could feel very well, the parents made great efforts to hide, or not to hide as such, but not to speak about these grim times and so on, but to create an atmosphere of a laugh and pleasant things. And this is the reason why they did not speak about it, but every so often a story came up. Either it was too grim not to speak about it, or by chance, did you know this one, and so on, and did you know the other one?
Were their friends primarily Polish people?
No.
No?
Jews. And there were obviously those.
In Israel, Jewish, Polish people in Israel?
Oh, no. In Israel, they immediately mingled with whoever, but obviously there was all this closeness of similar faith. When a person was from the same region in Poland or what, there was some kind of immediate communication or camaraderie, more than with local. But obviously, there was a good relationship with all the rest, and it's the fact that I met my wife, who is a Sabra of a Polish descent too, but a different Poland. The Poland her parents are from was Poland dominated by Russia, and my part of Poland was dominated by Austria, and there was a rivalship between the two groups too. I was a Galicianer, and a Galicianer is a special, it's not one ethnic group, a Jew, there is sub-ethnic groups, and the Galicianers were the worst of the lot. If you told somebody that I am a Galicianer, well, they would move aside a bit.
Did you have any family members from Poland who survived, who were able to escape from the Holocaust?
Yes. Well, one of this, I have here a photograph of my father in Austrian army uniform with his sister, whom he loved very much. And this sister of his married also a fellow from Tarnobrzeg who did not come back to Tarnobrzeg but settled in Czechoslovakia. And as Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Nazis, as well as Poland a little earlier, although they had already all the arrangements to leave Poland and settle in England, they had all the papers and all the documentation. And her husband, with one of the sons, went already to London to arrange the settlement and call the family in. But what happened because of different military activities there, the Germans already stepped in and it was already too late to leave. They were all taken to Terezin to begin with, wound up in Auschwitz, and this is her with two siblings. She had 6 sons in total. She went to Terezin and Auschwitz with 3 of these sons. Only one survived. She and 2 sons perished there. So one survived, and he, after the war, he joined his father in London, England, that already settled there meanwhile, and 2 of her sons left Poland before, Czechoslovakia, not Poland, before the war with a Zionistic group and settled in a kibbutz in Kfar Rupin in Palestine. And therefore the letter that we received in Siberia was from them. They settled already in Palestine before the war. They managed to get there.
When people hear your story, when young people and people hear your story, what do you want them to walk away with? What do you want them to have taken from your story?
Look how lucky you are. Enjoy what you are having. Bless every moment of your good life. And if there are some difficulties, don't worry, there are harsher things that you can survive. That you don't, if there is a little bit cold, look, there are areas where it's much colder than that. If you have to go to skate, watch how great it is to have a skating rink. I skated on a river and and fell every so often because the river was not as even as a skating rink is.
What do you believe we can do to fight indifference and hatred and racism? What do you think we can do?
Actually, not much. Do I believe in the human race as a people who are capable not hating? Look around you. When the ethnic groups got released, let us say, from a more from a regime that was limiting them, what do? They jump at each other. Look at Yugoslavia, what happened there after the communist regime fell. And look all the ethnic groups in Russia. Are they different people than we are? They are definitely not, because I lived amongst them, I saw them, and they were with me. When I was in Siberia, I was like them. they suffered shortages we did. But you see, when just given an opportunity, suddenly there are different other streams of politicians that push and pull and push one against the other. Did we learn anything? Well, we are trying.
I'd like you to sign off, and maybe, is there anything more you want to say? We have about 5 more minutes.
About 3 minutes.
3 minutes now before you say goodbye.
No, this is about it. Sorry I took up so much time.
Can you just say, now you've heard my story, I hope you've learned from me, or just some closing words and then goodbye.
Yes, there are many things that I will carry with me for life, and the most of the things would be the sobs and the trains going one way, trains the other way, and sobs on the train, and listening to the stories of others. And the more I live, the more appreciate my parents sheltering me from these atrocities that others suffered much more. And I always tell that my parents created for me a well air-conditioned car going through all these atrocities and keeping me well sheltered to see all that, to witness all that, but in essence sheltered me and provided me with what I live now. And I will forever appreciate that, and appreciate many of those Russians, like Natasha's uncle, that went and never came back and fell in a pool of blood in this snow. And I have some records made and so on, because children want to know.
So thank you very much.